The leather folder sitting on the conference table was worth less than the pen hovering above it, but the clause buried on page 6 was worth everything. A man's empire, a family's future, and the kind of quiet ruin that never makes the news. Julian Ashcroft sat at the head of the table like he'd been born there. He probably had. Third-generation money, the kind that gets its name on hospital wings and university libraries, though the Ashcroft family's real business had nothing to do with philanthropy. He was 40-something, silver at the temples, with the easy authority of a man who had never once been told no by anyone who mattered. His fingers rested lightly on the pen. The room was holding its breath. Tessa Marlowe was not supposed to be in that room. She was supposed to be in the kitchen, plating the second course. She was supposed to be invisible, efficient, and entirely forgettable. The way good catering staff always were at events like this. But the sommelier had called in sick. Henri was managing a situation with the dessert delivery, and Tessa, who needed the overtime more than she needed her dignity that evening, had volunteered to handle the VIP boardroom service. She carried the water pitcher with both hands to keep them steady. There were 5 men at the table. 4 of them she didn't recognize. The 5th, Julian Ashcroft, she recognized from the business section of the Globe and Mail, where he appeared regularly under headlines like Ashcroft Capital Expands Northern Portfolio and Ashcroft Foundation pledges $20 to Children's Hospital. Respectable. Generous. The kind of man whose face you trusted on instinct. Across from him sat a man she didn't know the name of yet. She would learn it later. Stuart Price. He was older, softer around the middle, with the look of someone who was now coasting on the memory of it. He was smiling too much. That was the first thing Tessa noticed. People smiled like that when they wanted something. The terms are generous, Julian, Price was saying, his voice smooth and persuasive. You're getting the Laurentian corridor rights, the Beaumont land, and the offshore holding structure. Clean. Efficient. The notary has reviewed everything. The notary, a thin man named Douglas Fenn, who had not made eye contact with anyone for the last 10 minutes, nodded once vigorously without looking up. Tessa moved around the table, refilling glasses. She made herself small. She had spent the last 3 years learning how to do that, how to fold herself into the background of other people's important moments, how to pour wine without being seen, how to carry other people's dinners while her own fridge held a half-empty carton of oat milk and her brother's insulin prescription that she hadn't been able to refill yet this month. She reached the notary's side. The document was open in front of Julian Ashcroft. Standard legal formatting, cream paper, 2 copies, flagged with signature tabs. Tessa's gaze drifted across it out of habit. She had spent 2 years at Osgood Hall before her mother's diagnosis had pulled her out. She'd read more contracts in those 2 years than most practicing lawyers handled in 5. She stopped pouring. The flagged page was page 6. The clause was in the indemnification section, which was where they always hid the real terms, buried under language so dense that most people's eyes glazed over before they reached the end of the sentence. But Tessa's eyes didn't glaze. They sharpened. Transfer of environmental liability in perpetuity to the acquiring signatory upon execution, including all pre-existing remediation obligations under Schedule C. Schedule C wasn't attached to the copy in front of Julian. Tessa had seen language like this once before. Not in a textbook. In the kitchen of her mother's house in Barry, at the table where her mother had spread out the paperwork from the deal that was supposed to save the family business. Her father's landscaping company, which he had spent 27 years building from a truck and a lawnmower into something real. The deal that had instead transferred a contaminated property's cleanup costs onto her father's company when the larger developer dissolved its shell corporation 6 weeks later. Her father had spent 4 years in litigation and lost everything. He'd had a heart attack at 53 in the parking lot of the courthouse. He was alive. But just. That was the only reason Tessa was pouring water at a corporate event instead of practicing law. She recognized the wording the way you recognize the smell of smoke before you see the fire. Walk away, said every sensible part of her brain. These men have lawyers, these men have drivers and security and people who make problems disappear. You are a cater waiter in borrowed dress shoes. This is not your world and it is not your fight. Julian Ashcroft uncapped his pen. Tessa set the pitcher down. She leaned forward under the pretense of adjusting the water glass near his right hand, just repositioning it slightly, the way attentive service staff did. Her face came close to his shoulder. She kept her voice below the threshold of the air conditioning hum. Page 6, she said. Schedule C isn't attached. The environmental liability transfers to you. She straightened immediately, picked up the pitcher, and walked toward the credenza as if nothing had happened. The room was silent. Then Julian Ashcroft said very quietly, "Doug." The notary's head snapped up. "Read me the Schedule C reference on page 6. Douglas Fenn went the color of old concrete. There may have been an administrative oversight with the attachment. Read it. The voice was the same volume. It didn't need to get louder. The temperature in the room dropped by several degrees. Stuart Price leaned back in his chair, his smile fading for the first time. His eyes moved to the door. One of his men was standing near it. Tessa kept her face neutral and her hands busy at the credenza. Her pulse was somewhere near her throat. Douglas. Julian stood. He was tall, taller than he looked in photographs, and when he stood, the room reorganized itself around him. You've been my notary for 11 years. Julian, I can explain. You think I wouldn't notice? Julian picked up the folder and dropped it in front of Price. The Schedule C lists 4 contaminated parcels from the Drummond development. Cleanup cost estimated at $38 million. Hidden inside a liability shield that would have transferred every cent of it to me the moment I signed. He looked at Price directly. How much did he pay you, Doug? Was it enough to cover what happens next? Douglas Fenn began to cry. Price stood abruptly, his chair scraping back. This is a misunderstanding. There are multiple drafts. Sit down, Stuart. Something in the air changed. The 2 men near the door moved, and suddenly the dynamic in the room was not about documents anymore. Tessa took 1 step toward the kitchen door on instinct. You! Julian's voice was aimed at her. She froze. Come here. She turned. Every nerve in her body was screaming to run. She walked back to the table instead. Julian looked at her for a long moment. He had grey eyes like lake ice in November, and they were considerably sharper than she had expected. You're not the somme you read, that clause. It wasn't a question. She answered it anyway. Yes, you understood it. Yes, you're a lawyer. Something shifted in his expression. Not warmth exactly, but a recalibration. He glanced at Price, who was now standing very still with the look of a man calculating distances. Then Julian turned back to Tessa and said, in the same even tone he'd used for everything else, I need you to stay in this room. Before she could answer, Price made his move. It happened fast. A signal she didn't see, a lurch of motion, a chair knocked sideways. One of Price's men moved toward Julian. Another grabbed for the document folder. The third. She didn't see the third until she heard the door to the service corridor slam open behind her. Julian moved faster than she would have thought possible for a man in a 3-piece suit. He stepped to his left, caught the man's arm at the wrist, and redirected it with a controlled efficiency that looked less like fighting and more like physics. The man went sideways into the wall. The second man had the folder. Julian took a crystal water glass from the table and threw it with precise, unhurried accuracy. It caught the man in the shoulder, not the head, not enough to seriously injure, but enough to make him drop the folder and stumble. Through there, Julian said to Tessa, already moving. He grabbed the folder from the floor with one hand and her wrist with the other. I don't. Service corridor. Now. They went through the kitchen at a pace that made the line cooks press themselves against the counters. Out through the loading dock. Into the February cold of a Toronto back alley, where a black car was idling, as if it had been waiting. Get in, Julian said. I am not getting in a strange car. Price has your face on a security camera. You just cost him $38 million in a fraud that's been 3 years in the making. He opened the door. Get in, please. She got in. The car moved immediately. Julian sat beside her, still holding the folder. He was looking at his phone. His expression was the same careful blankness it had been since the moment she'd whispered in his ear, controlled in the way that people are controlled when they're doing a great deal of thinking very quickly. Tessa looked out the window as the distillery district slid past. She thought about her brother Callum. Wait. No. Her brother's name came to her like a lifeline. Ben. Ben, who was 17 and had type 1 diabetes and who was at home right now doing homework at the kitchen table, entirely unaware that his sister had just inserted herself into what she was beginning to understand was something considerably larger than a contract dispute. Who are you? Julian asked. Not rudely. Tessa Marlowe. Why does a law student know how to read Schedule C environmental indemnities? She looked at him. Why does a man who runs a capital fund know how to throw a water glass with that kind of accuracy? A pause. Something that was almost fair enough. My father had a contaminated property liability transferred onto his company the same way, 12 years ago. Barrie, Ontario. A developer called Prentice Galloway. They dissolved their holding company 6 weeks after he signed. She said it evenly. She could practice saying it evenly. He lost everything. I had to leave law school to help keep things together. Tonight I recognized the clause. Julian looked at her for a long time. Prentice Galloway was a subsidiary of Drummond Development. She went very still. What? Stuart Price founded Drummond Development in 2004. Prentice Galloway was one of 14 shell structures he used to offload liability before each dissolution. Julian said it without inflection. as if he were reading a weather report. I've been building a case against him for 2 years. Tonight was supposed to be the end of it. His jaw tightened slightly. Douglas was the last piece I hadn't anticipated. Tessa stared at him. You already knew about the clause? I knew there would be one. I didn't know where they'd hide it. He looked at her. I would have found it. But you found it faster. The car turned north, leaving the downtown core. Through the window, the lights of the city began to space out. Where are we going? Tessa asked. Somewhere Price people don't know about. Julian glanced at his driver, a compact, silent man named Rourke who had not spoken once. You can't go home tonight. I'm sorry. That's not a threat, it's the reality of what you walked into. Tessa thought of Ben at the kitchen table. She took a breath. I need to make a call. Not on your phone. He held out a different one, a plain unlock device. One call. Keep it short and don't say where you're going, because you don't know yet. She called Ben and told him she'd be working a late event, that she'd be home tomorrow, that there was cash in the drawer for dinner. He said, okay, no problem. Love you in the distracted way of teenagers who were only half listening, and she felt a wave of relief so intense it almost hurt. She handed the phone back. They drove north for nearly 2 hours, past Barry, past the street where her father's company office used to be, though she didn't point that out, and into the granite and pine landscape of cottage country. The house Julian took her to was not what she expected. It was modern and glass-fronted, cantilevered over a frozen lake, the kind of architecture that looked effortless and cost a fortune. Inside, it was warm. There was already a fire going. I keep it stuffed year-round, Julian said, reading her expression. It's not spontaneous. I had Rourke call ahead when we left the building. You were prepared to run. I've been prepared for a lot of things for 2 years. He gestured toward a hall. There's a room at the end, clean clothes in the wardrobe, various sizes. Rourke's doing. He thinks of everything. Tessa stood in the middle of the living room and looked at the man who had just upended her evening and possibly her life. He had removed his suit jacket and was rolling up his sleeves with the focused, pragmatic energy of someone transitioning from one task to the next. He was not what the newspaper photographs suggested. The photographs showed a philanthropist. The man in front of her was something more complicated. You said you've been building a case against Price for 2 years, she said. What kind of case? He looked up. The kind that requires documentation, patience, and someone who can read financial structures the way a doctor reads an X-ray. He held her gaze. Which is where we currently have a problem. What happened to your documentation person? She's currently in protective custody in Ottawa. He said it without drama. Price found out about her 6 weeks ago. That's why tonight was accelerated. I needed to get Price to commit to the document in front of witnesses, with the fraud visible. I nearly had it. He looked at the folder, still on the table where he'd set it. I still might. Tessa walked to the table and sat down. She pulled the folder toward her without asking permission. She opened it to page 6. She read it slowly. Then she read the surrounding clauses. Then she went back to page 1 and read forward from the beginning, because that was how you found the threads. You followed the document's own logic until it contradicted itself. 15 minutes later, she said, the liability clause is the obvious one, but it's not the only problem. Julian, who had poured 2 glasses of scotch and set one near her without comment, said, tell me. She pointed to a section on page 4. This indemnification structure references a numbered company, 7841932 Ontario Inc., as the administrative guarantor. But the named guarantor on page 9 is a different entity, Westmount Assurance Partners. She looked up. 2 different guarantors. If this ever went to litigation, the structure would collapse. Neither entity would be responsible because each one points to the other. It's not just a trap for you. The whole document is a sham. Price was never going to deliver the Beaumont land or the Laurentian rights. He was going to collect your deposit, trigger the indemnity, and be gone before you could get a court date. Julian stared at her. He's done this before, Tessa said. It's the same architecture my father's deal had, the same doubling of guarantors. It's a signature, not legally, but operationally. It's how Price builds his exits. Julian leaned forward. If you can document that similarity, your father's contract and this one, my father kept everything. She said it quietly. He kept every piece of paper from that deal for 12 years. It's in a storage locker in Barrie. He kept it because he always said someone would need it someday. She paused. He said justice moved slow, but it moved. Julian looked at her for a long time without speaking. The fire crackled. Outside, the frozen lake was a field of white under a thin moon. I don't need you to be my lawyer, he said finally. I need you to be my analyst, the person who sees the structure, who finds the threads. He picked up his scotch glass, but didn't drink from it. I have legal counsel. Good counsel. What I don't have is someone who understands how Price builds these documents from the inside out, because they've lived the aftermath of one. And if I say no? Then Rourke drives you to a hotel in Barrie, I pay for a week and add some for your trouble, and you go back to your life. He said it without pressure. But Price will spend the next 3 months looking for loose ends from tonight. You're one of them. With me, you're an asset. Without me, you're a liability. He said the last word with a faint, bleak awareness of its double meaning. Tessa looked at the document on the table, then at the window where the moonlight was doing something cold and beautiful on the ice of the lake. She thought about her father's voice on the phone every Sunday, always careful, always steady, never once saying I'm angry, even though she knew he was. She thought about the storage locker in Barrie and the 12 years of carefully filed documents inside it. I want access to everything you have on Price, she said. Every piece of paper, every corporate filing, every numbered company. Done, and I want the storage locker retrieved tomorrow. My father's documents, I'll send Rourke first thing. And my brother needs his insulin prescription filled. She said it plainly, without apology. It's $340 this month with the gap in my benefits. Julian didn't blink. He didn't make a face. He picked up the secure phone and sent a text. It'll be handled tonight. Tessa looked at him. She hadn't expected that. The complete absence of condescension. Most people who had his kind of money treated smaller needs as awkward, like you'd said something embarrassing by mentioning them. He treated it like a logistics problem, which was exactly what it was. She picked up the Scotch glass. It was very good Scotch. All right, she said. Tell me everything you know about Stuart Price. They worked through the night. By 3 in the morning, the coffee table was covered in printed pages. Julian's laptop was running a corporate registry search. And Tessa had filled half a legal pad with a structural map of Price's holding companies. A diagram that looked, she thought, like a spider's web drawn by something that had given up on symmetry. 14 shells in 4 provinces, 3 dissolved entities, 2 offshore structures routed through the Cayman Islands. And at the center of all of it, a real estate development company called Drummond Properties that was technically worth nothing but controlled. Through a chain of guarantees and licensing agreements, assets worth well over $200 million. The pension fund angle, Tessa said, tapping her pen against the page. Here, Drummond holds a reversionary interest in the Mackenzie Harbour development in Halifax. The construction financing for that project came from a private lender, but look at the lender's registration. It's a trust company, and the trust company's beneficial ownership. She followed the thread through 3 more documents, traces back to the pension fund for the Nova Scotia Municipal Workers Association. Julian looked up from his laptop. Price is using public pension money to finance his own projects, and if Drummond defaults, which it will, because the Mackenzie Harbour project has contamination issues listed right here in the environmental assessment that nobody was supposed to see, the pension fund absorbs the loss. She sat back. He's not just defrauding individuals, he's defrauding retirees. Julian's expression went very still. That's federal, he said. That's the RCMP and the OSC simultaneously, Tessa agreed. That's not a civil matter. That's criminal. She paused. Do you have a contact at the OSC? I have a contact at the RCMP's Financial Crimes Unit. I've been building toward them for 2 years. Julian looked at the diagram she'd drawn. I didn't have this piece. The pension fund link. I didn't have it. My father's documents will have corroborating evidence from the Prentice Galloway side. The same structural fingerprint. Tessa tapped the diagram. It won't just prove the fraud in the document you almost signed tonight. It'll prove this is a pattern. 12 years of the same game. Julian looked at her across the paper-covered table. The fire had burned down to coals. Outside, it had started to snow. You should sleep, he said. I'm not tired. You're running on adrenaline and borrowed focus. He stood, gathering her papers without disturbing her diagram. A few hours. The documents from Barrie will arrive by 10. Fresh eyes are worth more than exhausted ones. She knew he was right. She also didn't want to stop, because stopping meant the fear would catch up to her, and the fear was considerable. She had a brother at home, a father in Barrie, who still believed in the slow machinery of justice, and a life that was precarious enough without adding corporate fraud and an angry real estate criminal to the mixture. Julian, she said. He paused. Why did you keep the folder? When we ran. You could have left it. He looked at the folder on the edge of the table. Because it's evidence, he said simply. Most people would have just run. I'm not most people, he said it without arrogance, just plainly, and neither are you, Tessa. Catering staff who can pass an indemnity clause in 11 seconds at a conference table don't just go back to pouring water, not when something this large is in front of them. She wanted to say something about how she'd had no choice, how she'd walked into this accidentally, how she was just a person trying to pay her brother's survival of the month, but she'd known, the moment she read that clause, that she was going to say something. She'd known before she'd finished the second paragraph. Her father had told her she had a stubborn streak toward justice that was going to cause her trouble one day. He wasn't wrong. She slept for 4 hours and woke to the smell of coffee and the sound of Rourke's boots on the wooden floor as he set 2 banker's boxes on the kitchen table. Her father's files. 12 years of careful, patient documentation transferred overnight from a storage locker in Barrie because a man she'd met 10 hours ago had sent someone to get them without being asked twice. She stood in front of the boxes in yesterday's dress and felt something complicated move through her chest. He labeled everything, Rourke said, with a kind of professional respect. Every folder, chronological, every document cross-referenced. He was a very organized man, Tessa said. He thought someone would need it someday. She opened if she had found it, a contract from 2012, a Prentice Galloway development agreement with her father's landscaping company, and on page 7, not page 6, but close, the identical doubling of guarantors, 7648201 Ontario Inc., and a different named partner. Different numbers, same architecture. The same fingerprint in the document's bone structure, like a handwriting analyst finding the same person's pen strokes across 12 years of forgeries. Julian stood behind her and looked at it for a long time. "It's him," he said. "It's been him the whole time," Tessa said. That evening, Rourke drove them back toward the city. They didn't go to Julian's offices. They went to a law firm in Mississauga, not downtown, not the kind with the Bay Street address and the revolving door, but a quieter firm, the kind that specialized in securities litigation and financial fraud, the kind where the senior partner had known Julian for 20 years and kept a standing protocol for exactly this situation. The meeting was 3 hours long. Tessa laid out the structural analysis twice, once for the litigators and once for the compliance specialist who joined by phone from Montreal. The banker's boxes sat on the boardroom table. Her diagram, redrawn in clean lines, was projected on a screen. When she finished, the senior partner, a woman named Adrienne who had the focused economy of someone who billed in 6-minute increments, said, "How long did it take you to build this?" "1 night," Tessa said. Adrienne looked at Julian. "Where has she been?" "Pouring water at corporate events," he said. "That ends now," Adrienne said. 2 weeks later, the OSC issued a freeze order on all assets connected to Drummond Properties and its affiliated companies. The RCMP executed search warrants simultaneously at 4 offices in Toronto, Halifax, and Calgary. Stuart Price was arrested at Pearson International Airport, boarding pass in hand, with a carry-on bag that contained 3 external hard drives and a Cayman Islands bank card. Douglas Fenn cooperated fully in exchange for reduced charges. He sat across from investigators for 11 hours and described, in methodical detail, 14 years of document manipulation, false notarizations, and deliberately concealed schedules. He wept twice. The second time was when Tessa's father's name appeared in the case file. Tessa was in the law firm's Mississauga boardroom when she got the call from Adrienne. She was sitting at the same table where she'd laid out the diagrams. Now surrounded by case files she had spent 2 weeks organizing, cross-referencing, and annotating in the margins in the small, precise handwriting that her Osgood professors had once called unusually systematic. She walked to the window when it was over. The parking lot outside was covered in March slush. Somewhere in Barrie, her father was at home. She called him. He answered on the second ring, she told him. There was a silence on the line so long she thought the call had dropped. Then she heard him breathe. "I told you," he said. "Didn't I tell you? I said someone would need it someday." She pressed her hand against the glass. "You were right, Dad. I'm always right," he said. "I just have bad timing." She laughed. A real laugh, a startled one, the kind that surprised her with how much it sounded like relief. She was still smiling when Julian appeared in the boardroom doorway. He'd come from a meeting with the RCMP liaison, and he looked, for the first time since she'd met him, something approaching loose, like a man who had been carrying something for a very long time and had finally been allowed to set it down. "It's done," he said. "I know." She turned from the window. Adrienne called. He crossed the room and stood near her, both of them looking out at the grey March afternoon. There was something between them that had been building for 2 weeks in the quiet hours at the lake house, over coffee and case files, and conversations about contract law that ran long past midnight, not because they had to, but because neither of them wanted to stop. "What happens now?" Tessa asked. "To Price? Trial. It'll be 2 years at minimum. You'll likely be called as a witness. I meant to you." Julian glanced at her. "I have a development project in Hamilton, commercial and residential, full remediation of a contaminated industrial site. It's legal. I've been planning it for 3 years. He paused. "I need a compliance officer, someone who understands environmental liability, financial structures, and the specific architecture of fraud, so that we never accidentally replicate it. That's a very specific job description." I had a specific person in mind. Tessa looked at him. I haven't passed the bar. You'd have the time now. The firm Adrian works with has a bridging program for people who left law school under extenuating circumstances. She was quiet for a moment. Outside, the slush was beginning to refreeze as the temperature dropped toward evening. The Hamilton Project, she said. What's the building? Mixed use. Ground floor commercial, 4 floors of residential. There's a rooftop. He said it like it mattered, and she understood why. A rooftop garden above a remediated contaminated site was a statement about what a place could become after a ruin. Does it have a name yet? Not officially. He looked at her sideways. I was thinking Marlowe House. She went very still. For the firm, he added carefully. For the compliance officer, her name on the building. Tessa looked at the slush in the parking lot and thought about her father in Barry with his 12 years of carefully labeled files, and her brother Ben at the kitchen table with his books, and the storage locker she'd driven past 100 times without knowing what it was waiting for. She thought about the look on Stuart Price's face when the lights had come on at the conference table, and he'd realized that the smallest person in the room had read the thing he thought no one would ever read. She thought about a clause on page 6. I'm going to want input on the rooftop design, she said. Julian almost smiled. I'd expect nothing less. She extended her hand. He shook it. The deal was struck, this time without a folder of hidden schedules, without a notary sweating into his napkin, without anything concealed on any page. 2 signatures. 2 people. Clean terms and clear eyes. Outside, the ice in the parking lot caught the last of the afternoon light, and for a moment it looked like something worth building on.